"Gold dang," Gramps said. "What a lot of birds of sadness wing-dinging their way around Peebee's family." Graham said, "You liked Peebee, didn't you, Salamanca?" "I did like Peebee. In spite of all her wild tales and her cholesterol madness and her annoying comments, there was something about Phoebe that was like a magnet. I was drawn to her. I was pretty sure that underneath all that odd behavior was someone who was frightened. And in a strange way, she was like another version of me. She acted out the way I sometimes felt. I do not think that Phoebe actually planned to break into Mrs. Cadaver's house, but as Phoebe was going to bed, she saw Mrs. Cadaver in her nurse's uniform get into her car and leave. Phoebe waited until her father was asleep, and then she phoned me. "You've got to come over," she said. "It's urgent." "But Phoebe, it's late." "It's urgent, Sal." Phoebe was waiting in front of Mrs. Cadaver's house. There were no lights on Mrs. Cadaver's. Phoebe said, "Come on," and she started up the walk. I admit that I was reluctant. "I just want to take a quick look," she said. She crept up onto the porch and stood by the door. She listened, tapped twice, and turned the doorknob. The door was unlocked. I don't think Phoebe intended to go inside, but she did, and I followed. We stood in the dark hallway, in the room to the light. A shaft of light from the street lamp came in through the window. We went into the room. We both nearly leaped through the window when someone said, "Sal?" I started backing towards the door. "Is it a ghost?" Phoebe said. "Come here," the voice said. As my eyes adjusted to dim light, I could see someone huddled in a chair in the far corner. When I saw the cane, I was relieved. "Mrs. Partridge? Come over here," she said. "Who's that with you? Is that Phoebe?" Phoebe said, "Yes." Her voice was high and quivery. "I was just sitting here reading," Mrs. Partridge said. "It isn't it awfully dark in here?" I said, bumping a table. Mrs. Partridge laughed, her wicked laugh. "It's always dark in here. I don't need lights, but you can turn some on if you want to." As I stumbled around looking for a lamp, Phoebe stood frozen near the doorway. "There," I said. "That's much better." Mrs. Partridge was sitting in a big, overstuffed chair. She was wearing a purple bathrobe and pink slippers with floppy bunny ears at the toes. On her lap was a book, her fingers resting on the page. "Is it Braille?" I asked, waving at Phoebe to come into the room. I was afraid she was going to run out and leave me. Mrs. Partridge handed me up the book, and I slid my finger over the raised bumps. "How did you know it was us?" I asked. "I just knew," she said. "Your shoes make a particular sound, and you have a particular smell. What's the name of this book? What is it about?" Mrs. Partridge said, "Murder at Midnight." "It's a mystery," Phoebe said, "Ugh," and looked around the room. Each time I went into the house, I noticed new things. It was a scary place. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with old, musty books. On the floor were three rugs with dark, swirly patterns of wild beasts in the forest. Two chairs were covered in similar ghastly designs. A sofa was draped in a bear skin. On the wall behind the couch were two thumpingly grim African masks. The mouth on the mask were wide open, as if in the midst of scream. Everywhere you look, there was something startling. A stuffed squirrel, a kite in the shape of a dragon, a wooden cow with a spear piercing its side. "Goodness," Phoebe said. "What a lot of unusual things." She knelt to examine a spot on the floor. "What's the matter?" Mrs. Partridge said. Phoebe jumped up. "Nothing. Nothing whatsoever." "Did I drop something on the floor?" Mrs. Partridge asked. "No, nothing whatsoever on the floor," Phoebe said. Leaning against the back of the sofa was an enormous sword. Phoebe examined the blade. Careful, you don't want to cut yourself, Mrs. Partridge said. Phoebe stepped back. Even I found this unsettling. That Mrs. Partridge could see what Phoebe was doing, even though she couldn't actually see her. Mrs. Partridge said, Isn't this a grandful room? Grandful? And a little peculiable, too, I suppose. Phoebe and I have to be going. We backed toward the door. By the way, Mrs. Partridge said as we reached the doorway, what was it you wanted? Phoebe looked at me and I looked at Phoebe. We were just passing by, I said, and we thought we would see how you were doing. Aw, that's nice, Mrs. Partridge said, patting her knees. Oh, Phoebe, I think I met your brother. Phoebe said, I don't have a brother. Oh, Mrs. Partridge tapped her head. I guess this old noggin isn't as sharp as it used to be. As we left, she said, Goodness, you girls stay up late. Outside, Phoebe said, I'll make a list of items which the police will want to investigate further. The sword, the suspicious spot on the floor, and several hair strands which I picked up. Phoebe, you know when you said that your mother would never leave without an explanation? Well, she might. A mother, might do that. Phoebe said, My mother wouldn't. My mother loves me. But she might love you and still not have been able to explain. I was thinking about the letter my mother left me. Maybe it would be too painful for her to explain. Maybe it would seem too permanent. I don't know what in the world you are talking about. She might not come back, Phoebe. Shut up, Sal. She might not. I just think you should be prepared. She is too coming back. You don't know what you're talking about. You're being horrid. Phoebe ran into the house. When I got home and had crept up to my room, I remembered how Phoebe had shown me some things in her room that reminded her of her mother. A handmade birthday card, a photograph of Phoebe and her mother, in a bar of lavender soap. When Phoebe pulled out a blouse out of the closet, she said she could see her mother standing at the ironing board, smoothing the blouse with her hand. The wall opposite Phoebe's bed was a painted violet. She said, My mother painted it last summer while I painted the trim at the bottom. And I knew exactly what Phoebe was doing and exactly why. I had done the same thing when my mother left. My father was right. My mother did haunt our house in Bybanks, in the fields and the barn. She was everywhere. You couldn't look at a single thing without being reminded of her. When we moved to Euclid, one of the first things I did was to unpack gifts my mother had given me. On the wall, I tacked the poster of the red hen, which my mother had given me for my 5th birthday, and the drawing of the barn she had given me for my last birthday. On my desk were pictures of her and cards from her. On the bookshelf, the wooden animals and books were presents from her. Sometimes I would walk around the room and look at each of these things and try to remember exactly the day she had given to me. I tried to picture what the weather was like and what room we were in and what she was wearing and what precisely she had said. This was not a game. It was a necessary, crucial thing to do. If I did not have these things and remember these occasions, then she might disappear forever. She might never have been. In my bureau were 3 things of her that I had taken her a closet after she left. A red French shawl, a blue sweater, and a yellow flower cotton dress that was always my favorite. These things had her smell on them. Once before she left, my mother said that if you visualize something happening, you can make it happen. For example, if you are about to run a race, you visualize yourself running the race and crossing the finish line first, and presto, when the time comes, it really happens. The only thing I did not understand was what if everyone visualized himself winning the race? Still, when she left, this is what I did. I visualized her reaching for the phone. Then I visualized her dialing the phone. I visualized our phone number clicking through the wires. I visualized the phone ringing. It did not ring. I visualized her riding the bus back to Bybanks. I visualized her walking up the driveway. I visualized her opening the door. It did not happen. While I was thinking about all of this that night, after Phoebe and I crept into Mrs. Cadaver's house, I also thought about Ben. I had the sudden urge to run over to Finney's and ask him where his own mother was. But it was too late. The Finneys would be asleep. Instead, I lay there thinking of the poem about the traveler, and I could see the tide rising and falling, and those horrid white hands snatching the traveler. How could it be normal, that traveler dying? And how could such a thing be a normal and terrible both at the same time? I stayed awake the whole night. I knew that if I closed my eyes, I would see the tide and the white hands. I thought about Mr. Winterbottom crying. That was the saddest thing. It was sadder than seeing my own father cry, because my father is the sort of person you expect might cry if he was terribly upset. But I had never ever expected Mr. Winterbottom, stiff Mr. Winterbottom, to cry. It was the first time I realized that he actually cared about Mrs. Winterbottom. As soon as it was daylight, I phoned Phoebe. Phoebe, we've got to find her. That's what I've been telling you, she said.